Hi, everyone. It's my treat to welcome you all to Will's fourth and final week of the October Action Summit for Women State Legislators. We are thrilled to have you joining us. I'm Andrea Pimentel, Program Coordinator here at WAND. Fun fact, my first year at WAND, when I joined this fantastic team as an intern, I witnessed and supported the amazing work that goes into bringing you all together and hosting these incredible conferences every 2 years. While we're not together in person for this one, behind the scenes, monumental efforts have brought many of us together again, virtually nationwide, and created this month-long series of brilliant panels and fireside chats for you all to connect and grow as you serve in your states back home. As a reminder, the recordings will continue to be available on our conference website. As program coordinator at WAND, among my proudest efforts is a pilot program we started back when I was an intern, a peace and security mentor program, the only one of its kind in our space, in Voz Alta. We've managed to grow and adapt this program from an 8-pair pilot to the 25 pairs we've worked with this year. Our mentees represent 18 different universities from around the country. We can all agree our nation is in dire need of fresh voices in the peace and security space. And within Voz Alta, we're working every day to deliver on just that. At WAND, we're focusing on opening doors for the new peace and security leaders of tomorrow, all while supporting you, our peace and security leaders of today, which is why we're so excited to have you here. This week, we have an amazing lineup of speakers, including Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, co-founder of the Poor People's Campaign, Georgia State Representative Park Cannon, Principal Deputy Spokesperson at the Department of State Jelena Porter, and more. They're all coming together to talk about how civil rights lie at the heart of our security. Our speakers will paint a picture for the future of U.S. foreign policy and share tools for you to take action and lead reforms in your home state. Not to mention, this is our lobby week, when many of you will take your asks and visions to your representatives in Congress. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to get us started with our first event of the week, a fireside chat, creating security for all communities. And with that, I'll pass it to WAND's executive director, the one, the only, Nancy Parrish. Thank you all again and welcome.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Andrea. I hope I live up to that uh, amazing intro. I appreciate that. Reverend Dr. Theoharis is having a little bit of challenge getting on to join us. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about the panel here for a moment and then do an intro with her. And hopefully she's on and able to talk. This fireside chat today, we really have had an amazing time kind of, I think, creatively thinking through national security and human security and what all of that means throughout the entire month, obviously. This week is really kind of near and dear to all of our hearts because we're talking about civil rights. So today, our panel is Reverend Dr. Theoharis and I chatting about creating security for all communities. To fully realize civil and human rights, we obviously must address challenges to our democracy, including the erosion of civil liberties and the challenges to our voting rights across the country. True freedom means human security, freedom from poverty, freedom from famine and hunger, freedom from infectious disease, freedom from environmental degradation, resource depletion, pollution, and natural disasters, freedom from domestic terrorism and violence, and freedom from political repression and human rights. Um, it is impossible for us to talk about freedom for anyone else anywhere else in the country when we cannot take care of ourselves at home, and we are not doing a great job. I'm excited to bring Dr. Theoharis to you, but I'm going to wait to do an intro until she's with us, and maybe I'll go ahead and introduce her while she gets settled. Um, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. She's the director of the Kairos Center for Religious Rights and Social Justice at the Union Theological Seminary and is an ordained minister in the U.S. Presbyterian Church. She teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Dr. Theoharis is the editor of We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible, the Poor People's Campaign. She's also the author of Always With Us: What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, and co author of Revive Us Again: Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. She's been published in numerous national news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, The Guardian, CNN, The Grio, Salon, Slate, and others. In 2021, she was awarded the 30th Annual Freedom Award by the National Civil Rights Museum, along with Reverend Dr. William Barber II, for their work with the Poor People's Campaign. Also in 2021, she received the Hunger Leadership Award from the Congressional Hunger Center, along with Reverend Dr. William Barber. In 2020, she was named one of 15 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress. In 2018, she gave, oh, look who's there. She gave the Building a Moral Movement TED Talk at TED Women, was named one of Politico's 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries whose ideas are driving politics, and was also named a Woman of Faith Award recipient by the Presbyterian Church. Reverend Dr. Theoharis received her bachelor's degree in urban studies from the University of Pennsylvania, her master's in divinity from the Union Theological Seminary, where she was the first William Sloane Coffin Scholar, and her PhD from Union in New Testament and Christian origins. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Good morning. How are you?
I'm really well. How are you doing?
I'm great. I am so excited to speak with you this morning.
Me the same.
Sorry, I know you had some challenges getting in the door here, but I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
So we're really just kind of chatting, you and I, for the benefit of
Right.
others, which means I'm supposed to ask you smart questions and let you chat because you're who everyone is here to hear from today. So maybe with that, could you tell us a little bit about your work with the Poor People's Campaign and how you see that relating to peace and security?
Great. Yeah. So again, it's really an honor to be here in conversation in this chat with you. We formed the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, about 4 years ago. And our work is about addressing the intersecting injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, militarism in the war economy, and this false moral narrative of Christian nationalism. And, from the very beginning, the outset of our work, we see the direct connection between the fact that we live in a society and a country that has 140 million people who are poor, or one storm, one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one small emergency away from economic ruin. And in that nation, we spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar federally on war, on military, on the kind of expenses that that are not about lifting from the bottom. When this nation obviously has lots of resources, but also spends less than 15 cents on education and healthcare and living wage jobs and anti-poverty programs combined. And so, I think we see, right now in every kind of aspect of life, how militarism and peace and security issues are impacting poor and low income people, first and worst, and also making it so that we live, again, in a society that doesn't value life, but in fact, has more of a death measurement to it.
Yeah, so that is true. I had to write down your personal work. That is, it's grim, but that is I think it's a succinct way to put that. So when you talk about, your fundamental principle of transforming a war economy into a peace economy, can you share with us or talk a little bit about, what that might look like, what that might feel like if we could transition to that? And then maybe we'll talk a little bit how we get there, but how would that feel different?
Yeah, even if we just consider the debate happening in Congress right now, where we're talking about whether our society can afford a 3.5 trillion over 10 years Build Back Better plan, when we already, as a nation and Congress, have already authorized more than 7 trillion, more than twice that. And so what would it look like for us to invest in human needs? What does it look like to guarantee healthcare and living wages and programs that lift from the bottom? What would it look like? Can we imagine that instead of having bordered police detaining people, instead of having military equipment being brought into our communities, instead of there is no legal draft, but instead of the poverty draft that exists, where the only way that poor and low income people are able to often get an education and everything like that is by enlisting in the military forces. I mean, what can we imagine if we instead spent those resources on lifting up from the bottom? I mean, it would mean we could end child poverty. It would mean that we could ensure that everybody has a decent place to live. It would mean that we could make sure that people are bearing the fruit of their labor and earning living wages and having paid sick leave. It would mean all of these things that would really make life better for not just the 140 million poor and low income people, but for our whole society. But instead, we invest in war. We invest in death. We invest in the things that bring about the demise of people. And it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't make our nation any more secure to be spending all of these resources. In fact, it's just the opposite. And so one of the roles of the organizing work that we're doing in terms of shifting the narrative and trying to build power amongst poor and low-income people, part of it is about instilling in our nation the sense that it does not have to be this way. These are political choices, and especially this war economy, is something that we have had too much of. The fact that we have invested $21 trillion since 9/11 in war, in deportation, in detention, in this border wall, right? Just imagine $21 trillion poured into rural communities and hospitals, poured into urban communities and child care centers. Like what a difference that could make, and how much life would be better for everybody. And so let's imagine that together.
Yeah, I think about that when you say that. It makes me think about the way we collectively communicate. And so when we talk about this war economy, it's done in the name of national security and safety, and but we get into, well, whose safety are we talking about? And I don't have the answer for this, but how do we kind of reclaim that narrative and get back to, well, how safe am I if I'm not sure I have a roof over my head or food in my belly, or my kid has a good school to go to, or I don't know. Anyway, a little off script, but it gets me going.
No, I agree with that. That's right. That's right. Well, even just posing those questions, I think, get us part of the way, right? Even folks starting to think like, is my life better because there are more people policing my neighborhood? Is my life better because we're wreaking havoc on the lives and livelihoods of people all over the world? And when Dr. King talked about these tripartite evils back in the 60s, 67, when he comes out against the Vietnam War, there's still lessons in him coming out for us today. And he says that he started to see that the Vietnam War was a cruel manipulation of the poor, where you had poor people of all races coming from the United States to go kill poor people of various races in other parts of the world. And who was benefiting from it was simply the wealthy and powerful, and not the vast majority of people.
Yeah, no, I watched some of those speeches recently. Again, kind of getting back into that, and you're right. There's a lot to learn still there for us. We touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And when folks argue for a strong defense being critical to our national security, who does that benefit and who does that leave behind? And you've kind of touched on that, but in other words, whose security? Maybe a little bit turn. You sort of saying, is my life better? But is my life even safer, or am I not being made less secure potentially? So whose security are we ensuring, and who are we threatening?
Yeah, no, I think we have to ask these kinds of questions, right? Again, kind of thinking about Dr. King, he says these are the questions that must be raised, right? This is what we got to talk about, and indeed, it's not that people's lives are more full or better, and the level of policing in this nation and policing around the world through our military, both wars declared and undeclared, right? And then economic sanctions, and then I mean all of the different kind of tools of and weapons of war and of militarism. Uh, in fact, it is leaving the people of other parts of the world and of the United States in a way more precarious, way less safe position. Um, uh, and that's because what happens when you don't invest in the infrastructure of a democracy and infrastructure of people's daily lives, then what happens is that that everybody's life gets a whole lot worse. And and you know after this many years after a unjust, immoral war in Afghanistan, nobody is better for it, except for, and this is part of your question, except for the military contractors that have just been able to eat up trillions of dollars, not caring whose lives are lost, whose lives are sacrificed, which veterans' lives come back to this country and cannot live with the horrors that folks were forced into. The fact that we actually lose more veterans to suicide than to active duty military operations says something about how we are not safer, we are not more secure, and we are not in a better place, despite all of the money poured uh, into wars and other kind of military actions all over the world. And so, I think indeed it's surely not, uh, you know, poor people in this country or across the world, but it's also just it's very few people that actually have benefited from this $21 trillion of money going into militarism. It's just the profits of a very elite few, and that isn't the way that you want society to be built. That makes a very insecure society. That makes a very unbalanced society. That makes a very undemocratic society, and not one that we espouse to live in.
How it's interesting to me to think about how that, once again, kind of back to the narrative, because obviously it is clear to all of us why the defense contractors want to maintain this. It makes perfect sense. We get it. Why do you think it is, and how do we end up shifting? I feel like some of the people who are harmed the most at times are kind of the most resistant to change that would really ultimately benefit them directly. And I don't know if that's just a failure of our ability to communicate it. I don't know why, because if we did a better job, or if that was communicated appropriately, I feel like there'd be a groundswell of support amongst the people who are harmed. Well, I'm just, again, off script here. Sorry, curious about your thoughts about that.
No, I appreciate this. I mean, I think there's a number of things. I mean, I think that really who is controlling this narrative and is keeping all of this resources in really are the military contractors and those that really benefit from having things organized the way that they are. And because they pour so much money into the media, because they pour so much money into campaigns at a very local level, and because for so many years our elected officials have not been able to, lift the load of poverty for folks. So I understand why a community gets worried that a military base is going to get closed in their community, because those are the jobs that exist, right? You go to some communities across the country and the only decent jobs, and sometimes they're not even decent jobs. Sometimes folks are having to, collect SNAP benefits and food stamps because they're being paid so little, their families are. But still, they're jobs, and it's a chance at potentially education and all of these kinds of things. And so, if we were to actually invest in the things that everybody needs, then I think there would be that groundswell. It's because that for so long, I mean, we saw this in the pandemic. In the first couple of months, the Federal Reserve pours tons of money into Wall Street, right? But very little into the people. And that first CARES Act, 84% basically went to the rich and went to corporations. But then the minute that folks are worried about, both international relationships, but also policing these protests in our cities because people are daring to say Black Lives Matter and organize because of police brutality and injustice, again, the society finds tons of resources to then equip those police departments with more and more resources. And so when it's the Wall Street, when it's the military industrial complex and when it's police departments that need more money, they get it, and they get more than they even ask for, right? I mean, the budget, the Pentagon budget this year, there are things in there that the military didn't even ask for, but that are in there. But when we, as regular people, as poor people, as workers, as people of conscience, when we dare to say, well, can't this be another way? Then we're told that we're being too idealistic and we're asking for too much and we just simply can't afford it. And we're going to have people in our society become entitled. This entitlement mentality, which is all race code words for pitting people against each other and demonizing Black and brown people. And again, it's just because of that, when our society, we need legislators who are going to stand up and say, we're going to invest in our communities and not in military. And our experience is that when that happens, people are across all the lines of division, across race, across geography, people unite with that. It's just that we're not hearing it enough.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for that. I really appreciate that. That is a really good lead in too to what I want to ask you a little bit more about. We're going to be talking later this week more about the 1033 program, which is the federal program that transfers military grade equipment to state and local police forces, law enforcement, for them to use on our fellow citizens. What do you see from your perspective? What's the impact on local communities who then have to interact with these forces and this weaponry? What does that end up looking like for folks?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you all are paying more attention to this, and I mean, and just and calling this out, because it's such a problematic aspect of this Defense Reauthorization Act, right? The idea that there are 49 states across this country that have basically military grade equipment coming into local police departments, but also other public departments, right? I mean, the Los Angeles Unified School District, they have equipment from the 1033 program. Why do public school kids in LA need folks with bombs and grenades and military equipment in our schools? We don't need that. We already know what happens when there's the militarization of our schools, and it means death. That's what it means for our young people, for our teachers, for our families. What that also looks like is you have these like local police enforcement who are not equipped to use this equipment, and then almost get into this mentality that they're at war with the people of their town. When so many of the things that are happening that involve police are not the kinds of conflicts where we want to be bringing military grade equipment into that equation. And so, again, we know in the protests around the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, that some of those tanks were from the 1033 program. We know that in other places, small towns across the country, we have equipment that should not be there. And in fact, as a Christian leader myself, I think about this kind of beating of swords into plowshares, that actually the message of our sacred texts is that it's not that we should be bringing those swords and those weapons into our communities. We should be, studying war no more, and we should be in fact, putting forward the kinds of things that could make everybody thrive. And so, I'm glad that folks are talking about this, because this program is highly problematic, and in more than 8,000 communities. It's vast. It's and again, it's not what it's not what our kids need.
Yeah, it is one of those times where that we really literally bring that militarism home. It's we have a number in this group of state legislators. Hello, state legislators, thank you for being here. And it is one of the awesome places where it's sometimes hard to feel, I think, at a state or local level that you can have an impact on these, what feel like gigantic national issues and numbers that we can't even begin to comprehend. But some legislation that has popped up in states that either limits or prevents 1033 equipment from coming into certain communities is, I think, an incredible way for our state legislators, and even at the local level, to say no thank you. You can keep that. Maybe along those lines, like, can you talk, and we are going to have some time for Q&A. I think some questions have popped up, and I think some others will be coming, but and I would encourage folks, please do add, if you're listening to this and have things that you want to ask the Reverend Doctor, please put your questions in the Q&A. But I want to touch a little bit more on that, on how we impact. It is hard sometimes for these things that feel so big and so huge, and how can I, as just a little old me, much less even as a state legislator, as a strong, powerful elected woman. How do I call this out, and how do I create impact? I know the Poor People Campaign calls out our need to organize at the state and local level. That is, one of the things that I think is awesome about what you all do, along with everything else. But so what are some ways that our state legislators and activists can have real impact in their own communities?
Well, I really appreciate this, and I do think that, to be able to have national and international impact, we do need to go on a state and local level. That's where we can kind of build the kind of influence, the kind of power, activists, advocates, impacted folks, and our elected officials working, to put forward the solutions that are at our hand. That are there. We know what it would take. We know that if we were to cut the federal military budget in half, we would still have a larger military budget than hundreds of nations in the world combined, and then the 5 biggest, quote unquote, our biggest adversaries in the moment right now, right? So it's possible, right? It's possible to do, but it is about organizing. Whenever we think about social change of the past, I think it's really important for us to remember that things feel impossible until they become a reality. And I think that we often think about great leaders like Reverend Dr. King or Mrs. Rosa Parks, right? And we kind of go to the end of the story and instead of starting, at more of a beginning, and think about, the fact that it was, the murder of Emmett Till and his mom's strength to have an open casket funeral that then, brought up in Mrs. Rosa Parks the desire that she had to do something. And she got involved and was, the secretary of the NAACP before she decided to give up her seat, right? She had been at the Highlander Folk School for the training grounds of the Union and Civil Rights Movement, and she had a long life already of being active. And folks had tried bus boycotts before then, but you have to keep on trying, and you got to keep on trying, and you have to think it might not be possible, but then it becomes possible. And one of the things that we've learned from our South African brothers and sisters when they were organizing, especially when apartheid was still the reality, is a couple of them said to us the other day, a dying mule is what kicks the hardest. So what is it that it seems so unimaginable that we could actually, take on these injustices, these evils of racism and of poverty and of militarism and of the destruction of the earth. But what if it's because actually those systems are already kind of crumbling, and we're helping to usher in, a kind of a transformation from the bottom that is possible. And so I just think in these kind of moments, there's a help in us going back to history and looking at it's when things in the words of Dr. King, it's when the sky is the most dark that you can see the stars, right? It's actually when things feel so much that there opens up a possibility for us to organize in our local areas, and that's exactly what we got to do, and we know it's working. We know that that people are hearing the fact that people are ready to come together and organize in different ways, and are so empowered when they hear about elected officials who are actually, interested in the issues that impact regular people. And so we got to keep at it, and we know that when we keep at it and when we're strategic about it, we in fact can make a difference.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I was watching recently The Boys Who Said No, which is about the draft resistors, and it's very funny. I am old enough that I have, tiny little kid memories of that. Like, that was just reality. That was an experience that was sort of, that's just the way it is. We can't really do it different. And how grim and hard that fight was. And people put their livelihoods and lives on the line to move on. So, and make change. And go ahead.
No, but that's a really important point too. It's that, it's times like these where somebody has to come forward. Everybody doesn't have to come forward, but somebody has to come forward. And then when they come forward, and it's not an easy fight, it's not, going to happen overnight. But when they come forward, guess what? Then other people come forward. And so to see this powerful network you all have here as the first that are waking up to this and putting yourselves out there around this. And knowing that when we do that others will come. They won't all come immediately, and they won't all win. We won't win them all. But it does make a difference, and it inspires others. And in the again, as a preacher and as a biblical scholar, sometimes God will say, if I can just get one, right? Well, y'all have more than one. So we're already making a lot more progress here. Exactly.
I am looking in the Q&A. I see Anne has a lot of really, not a lot of questions, but a lot of, she's your number one fan, I can tell you that. Talking about accountability of the Pentagon budget and the fact that we don't have an audit and criminalizing poverty. We're with you, Anne. But I'm looking down here, and there's a couple of others I'd love to kind of check in on. So are there initial, again, speaking kind of specifically to our state legislators, are there initial policy changes that you would recommend that our state legislators focus on, and how to really, address the poor people in their own communities, the low income folks in their communities that would be of most benefit?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I actually want to refer folks to a number of the different kind of both agendas and other kind of policy pieces that the Poor People's Campaign has put out. We have a resolution that was inspired by our agenda that was introduced into the House by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. And at this point, it's on a federal level, on a national level. But we're hoping that actually on a state level, similar kinds of resolutions can be put forward, and that make the connections between all of these different issues, but take on militarism and peace and security issues in a very direct way. And so it's everything including, getting rid of the 1033 programs and some of the different kind of nuclear funding and programs. But there's a lot of specifics about kind of just transition programs, where we train military folks into jobs that are more green jobs, other kind of sustainable jobs. I mean, what we know again is that military jobs are a lot more expensive, not because people are being paid well, but because of all of the kind of taking off the top by these contractors and others in the military. And so, if we can create jobs in the community that are about feeding people and about educating our kids, and then have a just transition for folks that have been working in military, to be able to go into some of those jobs. I mean, that's some of the work that can happen on a very local level, and then it can reverberate throughout the community, throughout the state, throughout the country, because it shows that, guess what? When we invest in early childhood education, and not the military, this helps everybody. And then people have that real world impact, and see the results of it. So I would encourage folks to read that resolution. It's called Third Reconstruction, Fully Addressing Poverty and Low Wages from the Bottom Up. We also have a full program called the Jubilee Platform. And in it, again, are a bunch of the policy recommendations and prescriptions that we have coming out of poor and low income communities that are organizing, putting forward, let's not invest in this, let's invest in that, and really saying and showing that we found the money, and it was in some of our military spending on a local level, on a state level, on a national level. It's in the lack of fair taxation system. It's about not investing at this point. The reason we haven't been able to do these things is we don't invest in the right things, but we can change all of that. And so there's this Jubilee platform, there's this Third Reconstruction resolution, and then I'd also encourage folks to look at this Poor People's Moral Action Budget, or moral budget, that we have, because in it, again, we take on a bunch of the kind of policy and legislative priorities, and show kind of the true costs of our investing in military and not in the people.
Yeah, that's all great. We will make sure and put those links both in the chat and make them available as resources for all of our attendees here. That also makes me think of, and the ability to kind of come really from the bottom up, is the work that former Mayor Michael Tubbs did in Stockton originally with the universal basic income. And I remember, I'm a native Californian, so I pay more attention maybe to California than some do. But it was just absolutely sort of mocked and ludicrous. And why would you do this? And they're just going to waste it. Like everyone's just going to, I don't know, drink it, smoke it up or whatever. And all of the studies that came out of him, as the one who stood up and said, okay, I'll take the heat here and do this, is now a movement amongst mayors nationwide to start beginning offering universal basic income, and how successful that's been, even just a small amount of money. So anyway, it makes me think of that kind of approach.
It's a great example.
How about this from Jenna? Over the course of your work with the Poor People's Campaign, how has your perception of human security changed?
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful question, right? So before the pandemic hit, the United States experienced 250,000 people every year, about 700 a day, dying from poverty and inequality. Any nation that has the resources to, build a prefab house in 45 minutes and throws out more food than it takes to feed every person, any nation that has gotten okay with people dying from poverty is not a secure nation. And so I think over the course of, what has now been more than 25 years of my life, organizing and working in very poor communities with poor and homeless and low wage workers, it's very clear that that we are not living in human secure times, not in the richest country in the world, nor all over the world. And so, and I think doing this work reminds us very much of that. But it also reminds you of the potential that it doesn't have to be this way. So to see, for instance, the kind of level of poverty, of homelessness, of the lack of healthcare, moms that have to bury their kids because they didn't have healthcare, folks that have raw sewage in 2021 in their yards and mold in their homes, the lack of water. I mean, all of these things that are not secure. And then to hear, all of this rhetoric around, national security and freedom and liberty and all of these things kind of together, again, if we got comfortable as a nation with, before this pandemic, let alone what we've seen of the willingness to especially expend poor and low wage lives, to call people essential, but to still, not pay people enough to be able to afford all of the essentials of life. There is something, wrong with this society, and again, in the words of Dr. King, it's a society that spends more on war than on, programs of human uplift is approaching spiritual death. And so that is definitely, it impacted me in the course of this work. But again, as I was saying, what's also impacted me is to be inspired by folks who have very little, and who are saying, well, let's change the priorities of the nation and let's talk about, and I've learned this especially actually from homeless vets and other kind of low wage folks that have, that dedicated their lives to serving the nation, only to come back and find, homelessness and poverty and low wage workers and a real lack of healthcare. And so I think we feel more connected to folks all over the world in these different positions because of it, because, these problems are not just happening here. But this is, especially when we think about kind of the U.S. military industrial complex, kind of the belly of the beast.
That's the literal 800-pound gorilla, isn't it? So when you think about your experience, and we've talked about a lot of the different kind of aspects of human security, what are the issues that you think folks kind of most commonly miss? What are the I don't know if it's soft spots or easy wins, because there are none in this situation. They're all hard fought. What do you think is missed most?
Yeah, so I think even just framing things around human security, right? And then to define what that would mean and what that looks like. I think too often the folks and I was raised in a family that we were peace activists, right? My mom was having me, at anti-nuclear things when I was a very small child. And so I knew people from all over the world. And so again, when I say this next point, I consider myself in there, but a lot of times folks that are committed to doing the work of peace and justice, have kind of been siloed off from some of these other injustices that are happening in our society. And we can just talk about peace and security kind of separate from, issues of police brutality and mass incarceration and systemic racism and voting rights. We don't see that, like, we have to come together and make sure that we defend this democracy if we're actually interested in changing the military budget, right? And sometimes we are quick to ignore the fact that the majority of folks that are serving in our military right now are poor people and are there because there are no other options. There are no jobs. There's no other path to school. There's who's coming and recruiting in our public schools is the military and not green job companies. And so I think also so to me, one of the places where we have more and more, always more room to grow is making these connections and really showing that these issues are interconnected, and that instead of just saying let's cut the military budget, let's talk about cutting military budgets and investing in programs of social uplift, and instead of just talking about those programs of social uplift, impacting the middle class and folks with more blue and white collar jobs. Let's talk and make sure we're including the conversation about poverty and the poor in all of that, because again, who makes up 1/3 of the U.S. electorate are poor and low income people. And in this last election in 2020, in the battleground states where there were some real changes that happened, it was upwards of 40% of poor and low income people were the folks that were voting. But yet, in our especially national elections, sometimes this is not as much the case on a local level. We don't hear issues of poverty. We don't hear issues of low wages, and we surely don't hear the connection of poor people and the military in our kind of political discourse, and that has to change, because we just put out a study that Poor People's Campaign did a couple of weeks ago that talks about this waking of a sleeping giant of these poor and low income voters who are the first victims of voter suppression, are folks that are saddled with transportation and healthcare and job issues in terms of pushing on people's ability to actually vote and participate in democracy. But a third of not just eligible voters, a third of the electorate of people that are voting are poor and low income people, and that's a place where we can really make a difference. And especially when people hear the issues that concern them, and then put into office, officials, legislators who are willing to make good on the promises and actually impact people's lives for the better. And so this could become really how we transform the political landscape of this country, and how we make it a more secure and more peaceful and more just community and nation to live in. And so to me, there's a lot of need to make those connections.
Beautifully answered. There's one more question, but I'm going to kind of weave it into our wrap up remarks here, because we're getting close to time. But that makes me think of this concept of there is what we need to do as our professional lives, as our legislators or working in nonprofits or whatever, but it's also thinking about what we do in our own time, whether it's through our work through our churches or synagogues or mosques, or volunteering with nonprofits that are near and dear to our hearts, and really kind of remembering that we belong to our communities and have obligation to our communities. I think it's pretty universal regardless of your faith background.
Exactly. Like, we are from where we are, right? And
yeah.
so we're part of that community. And
well, Reverend Dr. Theoharis, this has just been awesome for me. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. I've been so excited for this. I've been dreaming about it literally for the last 2 nights.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, I really appreciate this time and the thoughtfulness of the conversation and the questions and everything, and look forward to being able to be connected more.
Yeah, we look forward to working more with you as well. Your work is just awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to those who've joined us, and those who get to see this, because the session is recorded and will be available for those that were unable to watch it in the moment. So I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Thank you.